Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mighty Chen and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos, Volume 3, also known as Chapeau by Priest, and we are moving into Arc 10, which is rather short. It was literally about 26 reading pages, so without further ado, let's just go ahead and dig into this. Arc 10, Fear. Chapter 81, Marriage. The 8th year of Long Gone, early summer. Although the unfortunate Marshal Gu had incurred the wrath of Tai Sui, the fate of the nation of Great Liang, after hitting rock bottom, seemed to slowly show signs of recovery like tender shoots breaking through an endless field of white snow after a long winter. After decisively quashing the rebellion of the western vassal states, the Marquis of Anding signed the New Silk Road Accords. The Black Iron Battalion escorted the tribute of violet gold from the western regions to the capital. With battle cries resounding throughout the nation, Great Liang finally carved a path forward. Shun Yi and company had just ridden into the capital with their consignment of violet gold when the Lingshu Institute came out with another piece of good news. There had been a breakthrough in the development of Gu Yuan's great iron bow, which had never seen widespread use in the army. Despite his humble origins as the son of a butcher, Gu Chun was indeed a brilliant young talent blessed with natural genius. He had invented a new type of gold tank that was exceedingly light and easy to use. It could be attached to an archer's bow and be perfectly controlled by human strength alone. The draw weight of the prototype iron bow, which could only be fully drawn by a master archer, had been reduced by over 50%, allowing Parhelion iron arrows to fly effortlessly from human hands. What's more, these shots were extremely accurate, since the weight of the iron arrows made them more resistant to being blown off course by powerful winds. Once these bows saw large-scale production, the use of the old Parhelion bows within the Great Liang military would be discontinued. Individual iron arrows could also be specially fitted with engine systems that would allow them to accelerate a second time in midair after being released or even explode after touching down in enemy territory to devastating effect. By the end of the 6th month, between the Black Iron Battalion's fierce vigilance and the steady worsening of domestic disputes within the Far Westerners' home nation, the situation on both the northern and southern fronts simultaneously fell quiet. For a short spell, the nation of Great Liang had an opportunity to catch its breath. Every member of the imperial court, from top to bottom, knew that the most urgent matter at hand was reassessing the hearts of the people. In this regard, the most pressing matter was the resettlement of the refugees who had been driven from their homes by the flames of war. But how could they go about aiding and resettling these displaced citizens? There was no way they could provide these refugees with land or property. Even the most incorruptible official in the world would be hard-pressed to find the noble character and steadfast integrity required to give up their own home to another. The Grand Council organized several grand assemblies to discuss the issue with the officials of the court, but still, they generated no feasible solutions. All they managed to drum up was a pile of rotten ideas like sending the refugees into the wilderness to cultivate virgin land. The long-gone emperor flew into a rage. He berated the court ministers as useless loafers, howling, "Why not suggest that we pack the refugees off to the East Sea and task them with filling it with pebbles?" Prince Yan of the Grand Council took the lead in remaining silent and abstained from expressing his stance. Meanwhile, the 6 ministers and various other officials submitted memorials, passing the buck to and fro, arguing themselves into a stalemate in the middle of court. It was then that Du Wanquan, leading a group of 13 prominent merchants hailing from every corner of the country, stepped forward and submitted a memorial in which he declared that they were willing to emulate the Far Westerners in establishing privately operated factories, and would bring in refugees from all over the land to operate them. This way, not much land would be needed. Chang'e had confiscated a number of properties when he had traveled the banks of the inland canal, punishing corrupt officials who profited from the plight of the refugees. These lands alone should be sufficient for the endeavor. They also planned on recruiting civilian artificers and tasking them with the development of a series of civilian use engines based on schematics from the farming puppets that had been implemented in Jiangnan years ago. Following the issuance of the second batch of war beacon tickets, a hidden undercurrent of power in the imperial court gradually reared its head. While they had lain dormant, these individuals seemed to have nothing to do with each other. But now, though they maintained a low profile, they began to push their agenda forward. A petition came before the long-gone emperor requesting the court grant special concessions to the civilian merchants who had been first to step in support of the war beacon tickets. For instance, they asked that these merchants be allowed to directly submit memorials for the emperor's personal approval via the Grand Council. They also asked that, under the condition that the military was well supplied, the emperor allowed them to buy a fixed amount of violet gold on an annual basis. This memorial was initially submitted by the Ministry of Works. Meng Jue, the Minister of Works himself, was a Hanlin scholar of humble origins. In the memorial, he wrote, "This plan would kill three birds with one stone. Not only would this resolve the refugee crisis afflicting our nation, it would also demonstrate the imperial court's commitment to treating those who have made contributions to our nation with fairness. Furthermore, the profits from selling violet gold at a premium to these wealthy merchants may be used toward additional military supplies." A single stone raised 1,000 waves. As it dropped, some of the sharp-nosed, high-ranking noble officials finally returned to their senses. After being absent from court for so long, Guyuan had the pleasure of listening in on the Grand Assembly, bearing personal witness to its magnificent devolution into belligerent saber-rattling. Stupefied by what he heard, he suddenly felt that this place was vastly more treacherous than any head-on attack or covert action he witnessed on the front lines. The 13 Merchants' Memorial stoked conflicts that had accumulated between the powerful noble elite and the brilliant but poor young scholars for generations. By this point, those with brains began to suspect that a backroom deal had been struck between the government officials and the merchants. Meanwhile, those with particularly sensitive noses had already caught a whiff of the inexorable future toward which this emergent force was pushing them, one in which the very foundations of the land-owning upper crust would be shaken. Faced with the threat of imminent decline, a sense of crisis quietly took root among the court's elite. In court, the pro-commerce faction accused the nobles alternately of forming cliques for private gain to bring disaster upon country and people and commentating from the sidelines when they held no stake in the matter. Some among them furiously jabbed their fingers at the other party and shouted, "If you're so smart, why don't you invite the refugees to stay in your fancy villa?" In response, representatives of several key noble families returned fire, their faces flushed with fury as they shouted things like, "How can mere merchants be allowed into the dignified venue of the imperial court?" And "Violet gold is a treasure of our nation. How can we allow it to fall into the hands of private businessmen?" In the end, they did away with all subtlety and straight up accused the opposing faction. "I wonder how many bribes my respected colleagues have taken to throw in their lot with these money-grubbing peddlers." The military generals attending the assembly took in the Marquis of Anding's silence, glancing at each other in bemusement, and continued watching from the sidelines, allowing members of the Grand Council to step forward in turns to smooth things over. Lifting his head, Guyuan glanced at the long-gone emperor. Li Feng really had aged. The man had yet to turn 30, but his hair was already streaked with gray, and a cloud of exhausted gloom hung over his brow. Guyuan was struck by a thought. Would it have been a mercy for him to have been hit by a stray arrow and perish aboard the red-headed kite back when the capital had nearly fallen? As if sensing his gaze, Li Feng looked up and met Gu Yuan's eyes. When the court session concluded that day, Gu Yuan was kept behind in the palace. After falling out with Li Feng before the war, Gu Yuan had been fighting non-stop all over the country. The two had barely an opportunity to meet in private. It felt like a lifetime had passed since the last time they chatted idly about current events in the halls where they had grown to adulthood. Li Feng had been seized by a momentary impulse when he asked Gu Yuan to stay, but now that they were rambling through the imperial gardens, he suddenly felt painfully awkward. He realized he had nothing to say. It was then that the crown prince, fresh out of his lessons in passing the gardens, came over to say hello. Li Feng had little interest in the imperial harem and wasn't blessed with many children. The crown prince, who had just turned 8, had yet to hit his growth spurt and was still very much a child. He was reserved when he saw Li Feng and politely stepped forward to make his greeting. "Father?" He cautiously glanced up at Gu Yuan as if he wanted to strike up a conversation but was uncertain as to his identity. Gu Yuan smiled down at him. "Your subject Gu Yuan pays his respects to your highness." The crown prince was stunned. The little boy loved listening to stories about great big heroes. Seeing Gu Yuan in the flesh, he was torn between uncontrollable excitement and the need to maintain the dignified bearing expected of a crown prince before his father. His tiny face turned bright red as he stammered, "Marshal Gu? No, wait, Grand Uncle, there's no need for such courtesy. This solitary one, I've studied Grand Uncle's writings before." Gu Yuan's expression turned a bit queer. "Your Highness is far too kind." The word Grand Uncle was like a fatal strike to the heart. He suddenly felt as though he had sprouted a meter-long beard. That day, Li Feng dismissed his attendants, leaving the crown prince alone to accompany them on their stroll. What he discussed with Gu Yuan was a mystery. The palace attendants knew merely that the young crown prince seemed to get on splendidly with the Marquis of Anding, and that the young lad clung to him and refused to leave. In the end, he clambered onto Gu Yuan's back and fell asleep, and it was the Marquis of Anding who personally delivered him to his residence in the Eastern Palace. Before he left, the long-gone emperor specifically bade Gu Yuan come to the palace and guide the crown prince more often if he had the time. Sovereign and subject had the most amiable chat, as if the quarrel between the emperor and the Marquis of Order and the previous impasse between political and military power were nothing more than a ripple in a pond, deliberately forgotten. Elsewhere, Jiang Chong hurried into a private room in South Ward Tower. He pulled a secret missive from his sleeve and handed it to Chang'eng. "Your Highness, please take a look. We've yet to establish a stable foundation in the imperial court, and now it seems we may have acted with undue haste." It was a copy of a memorial. Jiang Chong lowered his voice. "This was leaked from the palace. After today's court session, a number of influential noble families banded together and submitted this memorial to His Highness through Imperial Uncle Wang. I'm afraid they've been planning this for quite some time." Chang'eng calmly accepted the document. "Imperial Uncle Wang? Has he even finished wiping his own ass? The nation has been in a state of chaos due to war. Does he think that, since General Tan died defending our walls, there is no one else who will investigate him?" Jiang Chong dropped his voice lower still. "Your Highness, Imperial Uncle Wang is the Empress Dowager's kin. Short of conspiring against the state, nothing will compel His Majesty to touch him. Besides, who would dare raise that old case? Even if we really did leverage it to bring down Imperial Uncle Wang, wouldn't that also prove that the late emperor was duped by a wicked enchantress into wounding his loyal subjects? It would garner him the reputation of an incapable ruler. The son speaks not of the faults of the father. His Majesty would never oust Wang Guo over something like that." Chang'eng skimmed the copied document, his face devoid of emotion. Suddenly, he hummed in surprise. "What is it?" "This doesn't look like something that wine-guzzling waste of space Wang Guo came up with." "Who wrote this?" Chang'eng asked. "Ah, speaking of, This person does seem to have quite an affinity with your highness, Jiang Chong said. Didn't the Fang family once hope to make a marriage match with the prince? The person wielding the knife behind this memorial is Miss Fang's uncle, the current Minister of Revenue, Fang Qin. The late emperor personally called him Zhuang Yuan in the 18th year of his rule. He was the sole individual to rank first in all 3 levels of the imperial examination during the Yuanhe era. The man's been an extraordinary talent since childhood. Ever since Fang Qin took over the Ministry of Revenue, it had been operating in an organized and highly efficient manner. He worked well in tandem with the Grand Council, never hampered their work, and could be considered a highly capable official. Unfortunately, his views were shaped by his circumstances. He was born into the Fang family, so, as their representative, he was destined to become an outstandingly talented stumbling block for Chang'eng's plans. The examination mentor to half the court and a celebrated figure. Chang'eng rapped his knuckles lightly on his writing desk. It's high time the swallows that nested in the noble halls flew into the homes of ordinary folk. Jiang Chong's heart thudded in his chest at the killing intent within those words. Before he could think on it further, however, Chang'eng continued in a nonchalant tone. Minister Fang is indeed talented. Truly a competent minister capable of governing the nation. Prince Yan spoke briskly, and his praise sounded genuine. It was as if the trace of inexplicable malice an instant ago had been wholly a product of Justice Jiang's imagination. Yet still, there seemed to be a subtle undercurrent to that phrase, governing the nation. Fang Qin's memorial took direct aim at the long-gone emperor's weakness. It made no comment as to whether recruiting refugees to work in factories was wise or not. Rather, he clamped down on the administrative security issues of Violet Gold and refused to let go, going so far as to invoke Gu Yuan's name. This Violet Gold was paid for in blood, spit by the tens of thousands of Black Iron Battalion soldiers fighting on the front lines. Would it not chill the hearts of loyal subjects and generals if it was put to frivolous use? Gu Yuan wasn't the type to worry about such things, but Li Feng's sore spot had been well and thoroughly poked. Chang'eng himself had once advised Master Feng Han to back down on the issue of Violet Gold. Since the reign of the wise and fearsome Emperor Wu, the precious fuel had become like a second jade imperial seal in the eyes of the imperial family. On top of that, after his private Violet Gold stores, accumulated over generations in the Sunlight Palace, went up in flames, Li Feng had become all the more insecure when it came to this subject. Fang Qin went on to provide a thorough analysis of a long list of possible consequences that might result from the sale of Violet Gold to civilian merchants. For instance, after making this allowance, how would the court determine whether a merchant's Violet Gold was purchased through official channels or obtained through smuggling? If the price of smuggled Violet Gold was cheaper, wouldn't profit-seeking merchants naturally acquire it through illicit means and excuse possession of it with their special permits? Private stockpiles, illegal sales, and smuggling of Violet Gold had continued unabated despite repeated prohibitions. Would not these activities become even more difficult to police moving forward? Another example. Assuming no unexpected disasters, these proposed factories would likely outlive their founders. Even if the imperial court granted no more than 13 civilian merchants these special permits, what of their children and grandchildren? Facilities that burned Violet Gold would burn more and more of it over time. Otherwise, they would be unsustainable. Would the imperial court extend the special permits to these merchants' posterity as well? What if future generations branched off from the family? What if the factory was sold to an outside party? If these permits could be bought and sold, would it not be frightfully easy for villainous characters to hoard armor and engines to plot rebellion in the future? On the contrary, if these special permits were a one-off grant attained to an individual and not to the factory, then in the future, when these 13 permit holders passed and the factories necessarily shut down, would the nation not face a second wave of out-of-work refugees? The current generation knew their displacement was the fault of foreign adversaries. and that it was the imperial court that provided them with a bite to eat and a roof over their head. But could the same be said of those who would be displaced again several decades from now? They would blame the government for revoking the special permits and destroying their livelihood. Would these measures not simply sow the seeds of countless future disasters in the interest of solving a temporary crisis? These and countless other concerns were laid out within the memorial. Finally, Feng Qin elegantly signed off. In conclusion, those who advocate for the sale of violet gold to civilian merchants must be either simple-minded fools with their heads up their asses, giving no consideration to how this mess will be cleaned up in the future, or shit-stirrers seeking to fish in muddy waters, in which case, who can say where their true intentions lie? Every word of the lengthy memorial penned by the talented Master Fong was a knife stabbing into the long-gone emperor's heart. If this had been submitted to the Grand Council first, as it ought to have been, we might have been able to block it, Jiang Chong sighed. But alas, Your Highness, the Fong family's influence within the court runs deep. Zhang Gang suddenly shook with silent laughter. Jiang Chong looked at him, baffled. After a moment, Prince Yan picked up a cup of tea from his desk and took a sip, unruffled. Minister Fong discusses an urgent matter of utmost importance. He's not just blowing smoke either. Everything he's said is perfectly within the realm of reason and propriety. Even if the memorial were submitted to the Grand Council, what justification would he have for blocking it? Hanshi, aren't these words rather improper? What do you take the Grand Council for? A venue to abuse power and engage in fraud, deceiving those above and deluding those below? His tone was gentle, yet the contents of his speech were serious in the extreme. Your Highness, Jiang Chong began, stricken. Changgang's severe expression eased as he cut him off blandly. These words that flew from your mouth to my ears today will not reach another. I'll overlook this for now, but I do not wish to hear such talk in the Grand Council again in the future. Yes, Your Highness. Jiang Chong's face was solemn as he hastily responded. This lower official has spoken in error. Changgang's countenance warmed as he proceeded to lie through his teeth. My experience is limited, and I often lack insight and self-control when I come up against unexpected complications. I take you for one of my own, so my mouth runs away from me. I spoke impulsively. Please don't take my words to heart. Han Shixiong. Jiang Chong repeatedly assured him that he dared not. He had been personally promoted to his position by Prince Yan, so most took him for Prince Yan's trusted confidant. Yet Jiang Chong found himself increasingly mystified by this superior to whom he owed so much. The noble elite, led by the Fong family, would not sit idle while the young upstarts of the imperial court capitalized on this opportunity to climb to positions of greater power. They would, without a doubt, spare no effort to suppress them. Others may not have realized it, but Jiang Chong knew well that the rise of these so-called young upstarts had been single-handedly orchestrated by Prince Yan. Moreover, the situation currently under debate had been in the works since the enactment of government reforms, if not earlier, since the initial implementation of the war beacon tickets. This protracted deployment of opening moves seemed intended to trigger a certain set of circumstances. But to what end? Was His Highness Prince Yan merely doing this to save the nation from an unexpected crisis out of duty and selflessness? Was he really, as he seemed, so absent personal wants and desires that the very second their enemies fell back, he would immediately resign his position and go home to live as an idle prince sponging off the imperial coffers? If that was truly the case, why go to such lengths and lay out such a grand scheme? If the Prince Yan had some other aim and was merely weaving this enormous web of lies to deceive the nation, what could he possibly be pursuing? He was the sole remaining blood-related brother of the reigning emperor, Great Liang's sole prince of the first rank. If he wished to rise higher, there was only one position left. But that didn't make sense either. If Prince Yan had his heart set on the throne, why would he defy the long-gone emperor's verbal decree to abdicate in his favor? Even if Jiang Chong were to surmise that Prince Yan began to covet the throne after that day, why would he, as a prince of the first rank, go out of his way to offend so many important ministers of the court? Shouldn't he be trying to win them to his side instead? Jiang Chong was deeply perplexed. Your Highness, he began cautiously. Never mind His Majesty. Even this lower official has misgivings about the proposal to build privately owned factories after reading this memorial. But if that plan fails, how will the court compensate Master Du and the other merchants who have made great contributions to the state, much less resettle so many refugees? Now, this is where you've got things wrong, Chang'eng said with an enigmatic smile. When His Majesty reads this memorial, he will be filled with doubts about the sale of violet gold to civilian merchants. Seeing as Minister Fang has already outlined the situation so clearly, the merchant's proposal is no longer feasible. We would be better off thinking about how to solve the problem at hand. That way, won't everyone be satisfied? Jiang Chong stared at him in astonishment. Chang'eng waved a hand. Go home and get some rest. Ask everyone to come to the office a little early tomorrow. The Grand Council will discuss this matter prior to the court assembly. We mustn't let my imperial brother down. Jiang Chong murmured his assent and rose to take his leave. Prince Yan's serene speech exuded an inexplicable confidence. It was as if the prince had long foreseen the appearance of Fang Qin's memorial and had planned his response in advance. However, if he had the solution in hand, why did he not mention it earlier but insist on beating around the bush? Aside from exacerbating the friction between the war beacon ticket buying upstarts and the old money nobility, what did this accomplish? Wait, Hanshi, Chang'eng called out. His mind laden with worry, Jiang Chong snapped back to attention. He hastily schooled his expression into one of rapt interest, thinking Prince Yan had another urgent matter to discuss. Since you're heading out, please put in an order for me with the kitchen. 2 caddies of fried yellow croaker to go. I'll take it home with me in a bit. Many thanks. Just as Jiang slipped on a step and nearly tumbled down the rest of the stairs. Guyuan, detained by the long-gone emperor, managed to take his leave just before the palace locked its gates. The allocation of military supplies throughout the nation had to be reviewed by the Marquis of Anding before it could be reported to the Grand Council and forwarded to the emperor for approval. Guyuan had been expecting to receive the latest proposal for violet gold allocation after the Grand Assembly. He hadn't anticipated that the emperor would keep him until this late hour. Shenyi was left to wait for him until the curtain of night began to draw closed. Just as he was yawning from the excruciating boredom, he spied Guyuan slowly making his way out. What took you so long? Shenyi walked up to join him. For a moment there, I thought you'd gotten into another spat with His Majesty. Guyuan accepted the prepared memorial from Shenyi and flipped through it casually. I'll look this over when I get back. Anyway, what's there to argue about in our old age? Shenyi stared at Guyuan, thunderstruck. In our old age, he forced out around his knotted tongue. Sir, are you all right? What exactly did His Majesty say? He'd actually managed to tag the so-called flower of the Northwest, who spent all his time peacocking about, with the label of old. Guyuan glanced woefully at his shoulder. The patch of drool left by the little crown prince when he fell asleep on Guyuan's back had yet to dry. It was easy for a person to feel they were still young when they were single too long. But somehow, in the blink of an eye, he'd become a grand uncle. He suddenly realized that, at his current age, if he wasn't particularly blessed with longevity, more than half of his life might be over. It's nothing, Guyuan said absent-mindedly as he walked. Perhaps he was feeling disheartened from all the fighting in the Grand Assembly. He shared a few depressing words with me. His Majesty has always been competitive. No matter what he does, he wants to beat everyone else. He thought about climbing to Mount Tai to complete the Fengshan sacrifices when he first ascended the throne. But now, with the nation in its current state, he hasn't had it easy either. Shenyi listened in silence with his hands clasped behind his back. He was exhausted by the sordid affairs of the imperial family. Starting with the Yuanhe Emperor presently lying in the imperial mausoleum, their members became increasingly erratic. When happy, they would honor you with unparalleled favor and grant you power enough to upend the world, only to turn around in a towering fury a few days later and clap you in irons. In the worst case scenario, you wouldn't even know by whose hand you might lose your life. Just look at the Yuanhe Emperor. Had he taken decisive action earlier, Guyuan would have long reincarnated and would by now be reaching the age to take a wife in his next life. He wished to eliminate the Gu family, yet time and again he couldn't bear to commit. In this, he was like a cruel hunter who had wiped out the tiger's den. He'd already done the deed, yet couldn't follow through and kill the cub shivering in fright. Instead, he insisted on bringing the creature home and raising it like a house cat. He was utterly sincere when he killed and utterly sincere when he cared. And in the end, he had managed to raise the bane of his existence in the deeply devoted Guyun. It was honestly difficult to say whether he had succeeded or failed. Shunyi sighed. We spend all our days fighting out there on the borders, so we don't learn of the difficulties in court until we return. Prince Yan has really had it rough this past year. You know, my dad was just harping on about this the other day. He said I'm like the old frontiersman losing his horse. I'd received a blessing in disguise. My family has never been a famous noble clan, but we're still a household that has lived off the imperial coffers, producing talents through the imperial examination down the generations. When I willfully joined the Lingshu Institute, my old man took it in stride, but all my gossipy aunts lost their minds. Later on, I left the Lingshu Institute and ran off with you to join the army and scandalized them even more. But anyhow, either way, in the eyes of my aunts and uncles, I'm a failure beyond redemption. You have legitimate military achievements to your name, Guyuan objected. How does that make you a failure? Right? But my old man is actually pretty pleased with how things turned out, Shunyi said. According to him, there are all sorts of interests lurking beneath the surface of the imperial court now. The situation is becoming hopelessly complicated, so I'm better off following you out onto the battlefield. At the very least, we soldiers can rest assured that the muzzles on our cannons and the tips of our swords are pointed at the enemy. But Guyuan didn't find this reassuring at all. Instead, his heart felt all the heavier. He had no idea what sort of role Chang'e played in the chaotic imperial court. Thus far, the Grand Council appeared to be a temporary body specially created to help organize the nation's resources and coordinate the officials of various departments. Though it was at the center of state affairs and had the power to lead the 6 ministries and submit memorials directly to the emperor, its members retained their original posts. It seemed the Grand Council could be dissolved at any moment once the war was over. With Prince Yan at its head, the Grand Council's work had revolved around the needs of the emperor and the nation's 5 major military regions. Yet its members' true allegiances remained obscured behind a dense and indecipherable cloud. But enough of these vexations, Shunyi interrupted his thoughts. Right. Is His Highness Prince Yan still living at the Marquis Estate? What exactly is going on between you two? Guyuan was silent. Shunyi failed to notice the words, "Where do I begin?" writ clear on Guyuan's face and began prattling on his own. I've heard Prince Yan used to stay at the office of the Grand Council for weeks at a time. It's only recently that he started to come and go at dawn and dusk. Is it just me, or does this change coincide with your return to the capital? Hey, speaking of which, he probably wouldn't play around with you like this if he weren't serious. He went on a long and earnest ramble full of pointless, heartfelt nonsense. It was difficult to tell whether he was earnestly sighing over the plight of Prince Yan and urging Gu to accept him at once, or whether he was earnestly warning Guyuan that such a relationship was universally abhorrent to all levels of society and he ought to decisively reject Chang'e without delay. Whichever it was, Guyuan failed to comprehend a word of it. Frowning, he said, "I don't understand. What do you mean?" "What I mean is, I don't know what you should do either," Shunyi said, scratching his head, restless. "I'm worried for you." Guyuan felt that Shunyi wasn't so much worried for him as adding to his worries. He'd already slept with the man, so Shen Yi's sincere speech and all his heartfelt emotions were 8 lifetimes too late. But even if Marshal Gu's skin was a meter thick, it would be inappropriate to declare this kind of truth to the world. He glanced back at Shen Yi, who was blindly dodging his heels with seemingly no intention of returning to his own home, and arched an eyebrow. "What are you following me for?" he asked grumpily. "Are you planning to come back to the Marquis estate and observe how I worry myself sick?" Shen Yi scoffed in disdain, then mumbled under his breath. "Sushi, we go way back. Won't you let me come over and bum a meal?" "Is your family really that broke?" Gu Yuan asked, perplexed. Shen Yi went uncharacteristically silent. After hemming and hawing, he said, "My dad has been trying to arrange a marriage for me lately. He's a bit, overzealous. I can't afford to make the old man angry, so all I can do is take cover. Are you done? Careful you don't pull a muscle laughing so hard. What an ingrate you are! Here I am, worrying on your behalf, and there you are, delighting in my misfortune." Gu Yuan was laughing so hard he could scarcely breathe. I I have truly been enlightened. This is the first time I've ever seen a general begging for his soup for his supper to avoid being forced into marriage. "Gutsushi, is there any friendship left between us? If so, then shut your damn mouth. Treat me to a nice meal, and I might forgive you." Shen Yi deeply regretted not taking advantage of the days when Gu Yuan was bedridden to exact his revenge. As expected, it was the fate of the honest man to be bullied. Only after exhausting himself laughing did Gu Yuan half-assedly console him. "Consider yourself lucky. Your dad is still alive and well to try to marry you off. Even if I wanted to get forced into marriage, there's no one to do the honors." Shen Yi looked downcast. "My dad's probably anxious to continue the Shun family line. He's afraid I'll die on the battlefield. It's true that I've made him worry to no end all these years, but I know what kind of person I am. I'm a long-winded worrywart by nature. If I had a wife and kids, I fear it would be difficult for me to remain on the borders. And you're such a lonely and helpless wretch. If I left..." Gu Yuan's smile slid from his face as he looked back at Shen Yi from a few steps ahead. "But lately, I've noticed you started thinking about retiring after fulfilling your duties. If we really do manage to beat back the foreigners, the Emperor will have no excuse to hassle you again. Plus, Prince Yan is still in the imperial court. His Highness has always been meticulous, kind-hearted, and just. And when it comes to you, I'm sure he'd take good care of you. After frivolously doing as I please for so many years, it's high time I settled down and started a family." "Ziping," Gu Yuan began slowly. "Could it be that..." Shen Yi waited expectantly. "You're secretly in love with me too?" Shen Yi tripped over a raised slab of stone on the ground. Gu Yuan shook his head with a sigh. "Those endowed with beauty can never live in obscurity. Ay, being this handsome is such a burden." Unable to bear it any longer, Shen Yi howled, "Have you no shame?" General Shun's multitudinous worries melted into fury. The two bickered all the way to the front gate of the Marquis estate, where they ran into Prince Yan, who had just returned from South Ward Tower. Before General Shun, Chang'eng politely made his greetings, then handed a packet of fried yellow croaker to Gu Yuan. "Fresh from the frying pan. Yifu mentioned these were really good last time, so I bought some on my way home." Shen Yi laughed stiffly. Gu Yuan coughed stiffly. The way Chang'eng looked at Gu Yuan, with that expression, Shen Yi suddenly felt that coming to the Marquis estate to cadge a meal was a mistake for which he'd pay with his eyes. Meanwhile, Gu Yuan heard the word Yifu and immediately felt his lower back begin to ache. He likewise turned mute. Thus, His Highness Prince Yan conquered two hale and hearty generals the moment he appeared. Beaming from ear to ear, he ushered them through the door. Chapter 82. Idle Worries. Shen Yi was, after all, the commanding general of a region. Gu Yuan was the only one so casual in his interactions with him. Others had to treat him as a respected guest. Guyun didn't care to manage the home, so Chang'eng went personally to give the servants instructions. Shen Yi had been wound tight as a bowstring since he stepped through the gates of the Marquis estate. He fidgeted in his seat for a while, then snuck a glance at Prince Yan's upright back and scooted over to Guyun. "You did it?" Guyun once again had no idea where to begin. After a moment of hesitation, he offered a vague hum of agreement. Shen Yi was appalled. Now he understood why Guyun had been so evasive on the way here. Caught between incredulity and helplessness, all he managed was a long, stuttering string of you. Guyun offered no further explanation. He plopped down nearby like a dead pig unafraid of boiling water, opened the oil paper packet, and plucked out a crispy fried yellow croaker. Shen Yi knew Guyun could be at times flippant and careless, but he didn't expect him to take it this far. His meddling inner courtyard auntie's heart roiled in his chest as he admonished, How could you just... You've had your monetary satisfaction, but what are you going to do from here on out, Go the rest of your lives like this? It's absurd. You have great power and prestige. No one's in charge of you. But what about Prince Yan? Did His Majesty agree? If something happens and you two go your separate ways, are you just going to throw away a years-long relationship? What can I even say about you, Gu Zishi? You're practically a beast. Dag. Guyun licked some salt and pepper crumbs from the corner of his mouth. Between him and Chang'eng, exactly who had been the beast? Guyun had truly been wronged to hell and back by this accusation, but he could only affect an inscrutable aloofness. Guyun sat where he was and refused to explain himself. Every consideration Shen Yi raised was self-evident nonsense. Guyun had, of course, thought of all of them himself. If it was merely that he found it hard to resist, he would just have to control himself. The world was a complicated place, to be sure, but even if he couldn't control others, he could at least control himself. If instead it was a love etched down to his bones, impossible to forget, he could simply smash a brick over his own head and thunk those oceans of sentiment right out of his brain. Parents, grandparents, ancestors, even his own name could be thunked clean, to say nothing of affections. However, Chang'eng had been afflicted with wu'erge since childhood, which made him incapable of ever letting go. Still, Guyun felt that he perhaps sabotaged himself in his attempts to be clever. Even now, he didn't know whether taking that final step had been right or wrong. But these dangerous entanglements and worries were impossible to discuss with anyone else. Guyun maintained his unperturbed expression. Once we recover Jiangnan, I'll take him away. Who cares what others say? Every day I'm alive is a day I'll keep him safe. He said this as if it were the easiest thing in the world. Shen Yi spent several minutes trying to catch his breath in a rage and rolled his eyes at Guyun. Guyun took another yellow croaker between his teeth, paused, then broke off half and offered it to Shen Yi. Hurry up and eat, then get out. Haven't you seen how busy he is? Working in the Grand Council from dawn to dusk? Have a little tact. Shen Yi nearly choked to death on that fish, about to collapse from fury. I came all this way because I was worried for you. And here you are, acting like a man who's lost his head to lust. Gu Zishi, I finally understand what people mean when they say it takes time to get the measure of a man. What part of a man are you trying to measure? Why are you so indecent? The army was filled with red-blooded men. Some hailed from scholarly families and could have passed the examinations to enter the Son of Heaven's court, while others were common military men who couldn't read a single character before they joined up. Their tastes ranged from the highbrow to the vulgar, and nothing was off limits in their banter. Making up dirty jokes in private was a common pastime. Many perfectly ordinary phrases could be twisted to have countless profane associations. Shen Yi started and thought back over the last few words he had carelessly said. By the time he figured it out, he was certain Guyun was a lost cause. "You're the indecent one," he roared. Chang'eng had been speaking to Uncle Wang at the gate. When he heard this shout from inside, he shot a confused look toward General Shan, who had begun hollering again. He turned back to Uncle Wang. Do we still have any of the loquat syrup sent from the palace last time? Bring General Shan a bowl. I'm afraid he's going to hurt his throat. Guyuan lackadaisically swung one leg over the other as he sat and watched the show. Once Shenyi's anger fizzled, he finally said, All right, Jiping, you can stop throwing a tantrum in my house. I know you're in a bad mood. As for the matter of marriage, though they say it comes down to the wishes of one's parents and the arrangements of the matchmakers, you don't have to marry anyone you don't like, no matter whose daughter it is. However complicated the Shun clan might be, what authority do they have over members of my Black Iron Battalion? Shunyi stilled for a moment, a gloom settling over his face. I'm not afraid, I just... Guyuan nodded. They were noble young masters who had grown up from boyhood together. They didn't need to explain their troubles to one another. Both understood perfectly. I've listened to how my aunts and grandmother speak of my father since I was young. All they talk about is how much of a disappointment he is. A man with neither civil nor martial achievements who spends his days holding an idle post in the Imperial Astronomical Bureau, loafing around a bunch of Taoists and monks. Shunyi sighed. There were 3 children in my father's generation. My eldest uncle had a malformed foot and couldn't pursue an official career, and my father had an apathetic temperament. All those years, my 3rd uncle held up the entire Shun family single-handedly, while I ended up quitting the Hanlin Academy to join the Lingshu Institute. My grandfather nearly fainted when he found out. He wanted to disown me, but my father and 3rd uncle violated filial piety to protect me. The family's discipline whip was brought out and everything. My grandfather's hand slipped, and my 3rd uncle took a hit to protect me. He was already working himself to the bone, deficient of both blood and qi, and he spat blood after my grandfather's strike. Afterward, his condition rapidly deteriorated. He was gone before he turned 35. That was part of the reason I insisted on leaving the capital and joining the army with you. Out of guilt, to get away from home, and to garner some accomplishments of his own to silence those haughty relatives. When outsiders looked at the noble family of means, how could they not feel some measure of envy for that lifestyle marked by fine food and brocade clothing? Only those who actually lived it would know it also came with countless restrictions. Sometimes I wonder if there's any point to it at all, Shunyi said softly. There really isn't any. You fight on the border of life and death time and again, all to make a decent name for yourself. But when you go home and throw open the doors, it's the same as when you left. Unless you sever ties with your whole family and get yourself expelled from the clan, you'll be a puppet on a string, led around by that complex tangle of relationships forever. I'm talking, just to talk. Don't take it to heart. My problems aren't anything major. Compared to your family affairs, mine really aren't worth a whistle. Guyuan laughed. They're all idle worries, right? Shenyi laughed in self-derision. Did you see the memorial old General Zhong submitted? Aside from military affairs, he also reported in detail on the dire conditions of the refugees in Jiangbei. And it's still summer. If we can't get them settled by early autumn, who knows if they'll make it through the year? They wake up every morning not knowing where they'll put their heads at night. It's only those with sinecures like us who have idle hours to stew and worry over the trivial matters in our own backyards. He sighed, and both men sank into silence. Guyuan suddenly said, Bring General Zhong's memorial to me tomorrow. If the timing is right, I'll present it in the morning court. I've had enough of listening to them bicker. Shenyi blinked in surprise. Any attitude expressed by the Marquis of Anding was backed by the full authority of the army. In all these years, he had never taken a stance on domestic affairs. Now was he going to stand with the Grand Council? With Prince Yan? Chang'eng, who had at some point wandered over, cut in. There's no need. Yifu, why would you personally speak up about such small matters? Upon noticing Chang'eng, Shenyi unconsciously corrected his lazy posture and sat up straight. Your Highness works yourself to the bone for the common people and the good of society. We money-wasting soldiers who know how to spend and not how to earn wish to donate our meager abilities to the cause as well. Chang'eng smiled. Nonsense, General Shun. It's thanks to the soldiers who have bathed themselves in blood that we have this space to breathe now. There are numerous considerations at play in the proposal to build factories along the banks of the canal. Your involvement would likely only complicate things. I can handle it. You don't have to worry. I guarantee I'll have everything arranged before winter sets in. The Prince Yan of today was no longer that naive child from Yanhui town. When danger encroached upon the nation, there were always those who stepped forward to take up the burden. This prince may have been young, but his command of the Grand Council lent him a steady aura of power that was obvious in all he did. He spoke as if in casual conversation, but when the words left his mouth, they struck the ground with force. Shunyi realized quite suddenly that ever since Prince Yan had assumed control of the Grand Council, the military had received all the money and rations they asked for. Batch after batch of engines and armor had been delivered to the front lines without the slightest hesitation. If Shunyi hadn't himself come from the capital and wasn't intimately aware of the ragged condition of the court, he would have wondered why it seemed, when it came to provisioning, that the nation was better off now than before the war. Assuming a serious expression, Shunyi cupped his hands in a bow. Regardless, this lower general thanks your highness on behalf of the thousands of soldiers on the border. What is General Shun saying? Chang'eng said with a smile. I merely perform my duties. Besides, Yifu has thanked me already, hasn't he? Guyuan was speechless. This little bastard! Chang'eng tugged that oil paper packet from Guyuan's hands. A few snacks to dull your hunger is fine, he said in gentle tones. But don't eat too much. We're having dinner later. Old bachelor that he was, Shunyi was almost too embarrassed to sit there a moment longer. This time, Guyuan didn't need to chase him off. He felt the urge to turn tail and flee of his own accord. Meals at the Marquis of Anding's estate truly made one's teeth ache. All right, everyone, that concludes the reading of Arc 10, Fear. And we'll be moving on to Arc 11 in the next video. So, yeah, I hope you all enjoyed it. Again, I really don't have a lot to say. It was nice, I guess, in these two chapters, specifically marriage, since it was elaborated on more there, to get an understanding of what's going on in Great Liang. But yeah, we'll see how things go in the future for Shunyi as far as marriage is concerned. So that just makes me bring up Chen Tingshu again, wondering if maybe she could be the one for him, since he is a soldier, you know, speaking of being on the battlefield and not wanting to if he had a family. Maybe if she ends up being a doctor on the battlefield, something can happen there. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Yeah. 我爱你们。